Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at Eduard's brand new release of the P-40E. This is going to be in the dual combo boxing, the Pacific Star, so let's see how I get on. So then we're going to be starting off in the cockpit. This cockpit is up there with one of the most detailed out of the box cockpits I have ever had the pleasure of putting together. It is overflowing with detail and I absolutely love it. As you saw, initially I put together the seat and then the rear bulkhead. These can be joined with the floor. You'll see throughout this cockpit that there are several parts which are very thin and fragile. I highly recommend having an accurate and sharp pair of side cutters so you don't run into any accidents whilst trying to get some parts off of the sprue. I personally quite like to use Zerons and they can be found down at Hannons London. Back to the build, it was now time to cement the control column assembly into the floor. There's a very nice indated locating pin which makes fitment an absolute breeze. Only a few more components to be fitted to the cockpit floor before I can move on to looking at the sidewalls. The sidewalls themselves off the sprue are very well detailed, only requiring a few extra pieces to bring them up that final level. This includes throttle quadrants and also trim wheels. Now, all of the built up sub-assemblies can be coated in mist finishing surfaces at 1500 black as a priming base. After this, we can start to do some painting. I'm going to be using Mr. Colour's C122. Although it is an RLM colour, I think it matches the bronzy green present in these US cockpits very well. I'm going to thin this paint down and then start to black base it onto all of these assemblies. In essence, black basing is where you concentrate the paint on the internals of each of the panels, leaving darker regions around the edges and any details you want to pronounce. Once all blended in, this gives a very authentic, shaded appearance to your model. To help me get into all of those hard to reach areas, I ended up taking the crown off of my airbrush. This just made it a little bit easier to access all of those areas and retain some precision and uniformity in my shading. Here was the final blended in result and I was very happy with how it came out. Moving my attention to painting up the seat, it was given a uniform coat of Mr. Metal Colours aluminium. With this completed, that summed up airbrush work within the cockpit. I could now move on to having a look at some detail painting. So I whipped out the hairy stick and got the new Ammo MIG Atom paints. These are a joy to brush paint with, giving super smooth and also vibrant results. I then sealed in all of my hard work with a layer of GX100 gloss varnish. On top of this, I can now go on to doing some weathering. Initially, I'm going to be using Ammo MIG's Black Knight panel line wash just to accentuate all the rivets and recessed details present in the cockpit. After allowing it all to dry, I could use Tamiya's cotton bud to remove any excess and blend it into the surroundings. I love these Tamiya cotton buds as they're super tightly woven. You can find these down at Hannons London. Hannons London is my local model shop and long-time associate of the channel. They are located next to the RAF Hendon Museum and very well maybe every modeller's heaven. It is stocked with all the latest kits along with all the paint and tools you'll need to make them into masterpieces. As well as this, we have a great team down there who will be able to assist you on all of your modelling queries and needs. I personally also spend a lot of time down there, so if you want to pick my mind on a couple of your projects or generally have a conversation, you know where I'll be. Thank you very much and I hope to see you down there soon. Whilst I was talking about Hannons, we cleaned up the rest of the wash and did a small bit of dry brushing with a light green. Now I'm going to seal everything in using VMS's matte varnish. After this, I can use Ammomig's lock and load, locked and loaded with the metallic pigment to simulate some wear and tear all around the cockpit. Now the final touch on the weathering for the cockpit is going to be using some airfield dust pigment. I'm just going to loosely scatter this around the cockpit in areas where I believe airfield dust would probably be building up. Now I could move on to assembling the rest of the cockpit. Initially, the seat goes into position with the included photo etch seat belts already secured. Then after this, I'm going to be putting the headrest in place and then onto the sidewalls. Once the sidewalls are in place, I could then fit the instrument panel in between two slats. I use the photo etch option, but there is also an option just to use plain decals if you are that way inclined. I can then fit the rudder pedals behind this, and finally one more bulkhead. Now, I'm not just showing off what I had for lunch, but instead I'm going to make use of this cellophane on this Tesco meal deal. I used it to create a far more in-scale and accurate gun sight. I recommend trying this out if you are going to build this kit as well. With that finished, that concludes the cockpit. I can now move on to looking at a couple of the other sub-assemblies within this kit. Specifically, you can see on screen that I'm starting to build up that forward-facing intake. I'm using a mixture of kit parts and also aiding them with some photo etch. I made sure not to miss out this part on either side of the interior of the fuselages, as that meant I potentially wouldn't be able to fit the exhaust stacks later in the build. This was followed by the rear tail wheel housing, along with some flaps on the front. Other sub-assemblies also fit in at this stage. Once they are secure, I can fit in that previously assembled cockpit into one half of the fuselage. There's some great locating ledges to really help for a positive fitment and not run into any issues. After this, the other half of the fuselage can be cemented on. I can now cast my attention to building up the wings. Initially, this underbelly piece slots in from behind. Then I move on to building up the wheel wells. Eduard provides you with both the canvas covered wheel wells and also the bare bone ones, so take your pick. Once built up, they are cemented into the top surfaces of either side of the wing. The tips of the machine guns can then follow. They slot in a very cool and satisfying way. After this, either side of the top surfaces of the wings can be cemented into position before that main wing assembly is joined with the fuselage. I can now turn my attention to the rear of the aircraft, cementing in the horizontal stabilizers and also the vertical stabilizer. The ailerons are also cemented on at this point. Finally, this underside chin piece can be cemented on in a very satisfying and Tamiya-esque fashion. Now, moving on to the transparencies. These are a little bit finicky. I made sure to use ultra glue here as it gave me a longer working time. Once they were in position, I sorted out all of the seams and then cemented on that front windscreen. The final piece of this puzzle is going to be putting in that gaping wide mouth right at the front under the nose. Now I can spend a little bit of time getting all of the masking and preparations ready before paint. The first bit of painting I'm going to be doing is using Mr. Colour's C122, the same colour as the interior, and going over all of the transparencies. As this was going to be an open cockpit, I wanted to make sure any of the framework that was visible was going to be zinc chromate. After this, the entire model received a generous coating of Mr. Finishing Surfaces 1500 black as a base. Before we crack on, here's a quick look at the scheme which I'm going to be doing, and that is Bob's Robin. In my opinion, a P-40 should always be an olive drab and neutral grey, as it just looks right. Also, a big shark mouth, I'm not going to complain. The first colour which is going to be applied to this model is Mr. Colour's C13, and that is neutral grey. Similar to in the cockpit, I'm going to start off by black basing. Black basing on this model definitely took a while, just because of the sheer level of surface detail, but I'm not complaining. It is a great base, and if you are okay with spending a lot of time, the results are great. At this initial stage, all I'm doing is trying to create a template for future shading. So I'll go around each of the individual panels, fill them in, and then blend them over. You'll see that this then gives a really nice template and kind of guide for where I'm going to be wanting to shade in the future. Once everything has been shaded in to a desirable level, I can start doing some highlights and enhancing the shading. For this, I've added 2 drops of white into the mixture and thinned my paint down about 10% more. I'm now very carefully going along the edges of all of these panels and starting to create small levels of tonal variation, which helps to create a stressed skin and modulated surface. It's good to note that once again the crown of my airbrush has been removed. This really helps me get up close and personal with the model and retain a high level of control over where I'm applying paint. Here is the result once the highlighting was finished. I know it's very bold at this stage. I'm now going to move on and do some post shading. I've loaded in Mr. Colour's 137, which is tire black, and very gently going over a couple of the main panel lines. This just helps to create even more variation into the paint and also accentuate certain aspects. And finally, after a couple of fine layers of Mr. Colour's C13 by itself, this was the final result. I was very happy with how this came out. It took a while, but my goodness was I pleased with the results. Now I can repeat this process to a certain degree with Mr. Colour's C12, which is olive drab. The initial process stays the same, by black basing in between each of the panels. If you would like to try out this technique and you potentially struggle to get this level of fine painting with your current airbrush, I highly recommend coming down to Hannant and I will let you have a go with my Procon and show you what this brush can do. I'm always more than happy to sit down with people and walk through step by step how to achieve these sort of results. All you have to do is come in the shop. After each of the panels were outlined, I could then blend everything in and prepare for the next stage of highlighting. Now here is where I deviated just a little bit. Instead of going through each of the individual panels, I started to clump a few more of them together and go around the outside of slightly larger panels, just to break up that olive drab. I didn't want it to be one tone of olive drab the whole way out, but be really accentuated. So, for this reason, just picking out the occasional panel seemed like a better idea. However, on the other hand, there were a couple of areas where I did have to do some close quarters highlighting. For all of these instances, the paint was saturated using a couple of drops of zinc chromate. Finally, I reloaded Mr. Color's C137 Tire Black back into the airbrush, very highly thinned, and accentuated a couple of the high use panel lines, mostly around the wing roots. And here is what I was left with, a pretty interesting looking olive drab. Now I could do a couple of the more boring painting tasks, such as the band on the tail and also the black aspects on the front of the nose. All of the paintwork was then sealed in using GX100 before the decals could be applied. The decals went down brilliantly and I decided not to peel the film. I felt there was no need to peel the film for these particular decals as I was more than happy with how they settled down. At this point I can't help myself but saying how brilliant that shark mouth looks on the P-40. It just looks right. After another layer of GX100 had cured to seal in the decals, I can move on to my first stage of weathering, and that is going to be using a panel line wash just to accentuate a couple of the main panel lines and a few of the rivet details. I'm now going to be using a variety of watered down oil brushes by Ammo MIG to create some staining throughout the aircraft. Although you can only see me working behind the wheel wells here, I did repeat this process throughout different aspects of the aircraft. So after thinning down my oil brusher using some odourless thinner or white spirit, I would then dot it in the surroundings and then slowly blend it in using a flat headed brush. To create more concentrated areas, I added a few drops of black oil brusher into this mixture and repeated the process. Although I mainly have footage of the underside, here you can see that I did repeat the process on the top surfaces and I was very happy with how it came out. Now, a very prominent feature of these P-40s were the exhaust stains, specifically how much white was in them. So after outlining the general shape of the exhaust stain using black, I then used white just to trace the inner portion of the exhaust stain, and this gave a really convincing effect. I then sealed everything in using VMS's satin varnish. I can now move on to the final assemblies of this build. I'm starting off by putting the main landing gear into position. They build up beautifully, but I really wish I would have got some resin wheels, as they would have just made this build that little bit better. They have really nice secure lugs, which make sure you get the right angle of the landing gear on the first time. Once they are in place, the corresponding doors can also be cemented into position. I used ultra glue for this step. It was fun to put each of the individual exhaust stubs into position. This did help to eke out a little bit more detail, but it does take a bit of time to get them all into their individual positions. I felt this build was missing something, and that something was some chipping. So I brought out the lock and load again and very gently started doing some fine chipping along the panel lines and rivet lines on the wing roots. This is probably where we'd be getting the most amount of usage from the ground crew and the pilots. A couple of the more prominent hatches and rivets also got this treatment. Now onto the final touches. The masking can be removed, the canopy can be secured into position, and the prop can be pushed onto the front. And that concludes a really enjoyable and fulfilling build. I'm over the moon, to be honest, with how this one came out. It is exactly how I pictured it. Anyway, let me know what you think, and without any further ado, enjoy the final photos and videos, and I'll see you next time, guys. Bye bye.